Today, are immigration levels out of control? Should workers have the right to switch off? And how do we tackle rising food prices? Joining me on today's Politics Live, the Conservative MP Ben Bradley, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons Thangham Debonair, Rachel Cunliffe of the New Statesman and the former Conservative MP and now member of Reform UK, Anne Widdecombe. Today,
I voted and campaigned for Brexit. Indeed, I'm a proud Spartan because I wanted Britain to control migration.
The Home Secretary wants to cut migration to the UK, but how will she do it?
She's the Home Secretary. This government has been in power for 13 years. They just seem to be trying to blame everyone rather than take responsibility for what they've actually done.
Are prices going to come down for consumers?
The Prime Minister hosts supermarket bosses in Downing Street. But is there a solution to staggeringly high food prices?
It's been a massive challenge for our British farmers here and also retailers to get the value, because at the same time we've got customers who are really challenged with their own spending.
And should bosses be able to contact you outside of work hours? Let's start with this headline in The Guardian. It's in response to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who's done some number crunching. 1 in 5 workers, it says, will be higher rate taxpayers by 2027. This is the consequence of tax thresholds being frozen for several more years. And it means that the number of people paying income tax at 40% or above, the higher rate, will reach 7.8 million people. That's 1 in 5 taxpayers and 1 in 7 of the adult population. Are you comfortable with that, Ben?
No, not remotely. I've always been quite public about my wish to see taxes come down. I think money is always better off in people's pockets to spend in the economy. So I would like to see, as we move forward, as the economy recovers, certainly in a manifesto, if not before, plans to reform and simplify the tax system and try and improve that situation. But obviously we've been through tricky times, lots of expenditure around COVID and all the rest of it that has to be paid for. But no, I'm deeply uncomfortable with that.
How do you feel about it, Thangham? I mean, it will include senior nurses and senior or higher paid teachers for the first time, but then this is salaries over £50,000 a year.
But it's also the Tories presiding over the highest rates of tax for 70 years, which is an extraordinary thing, and at the same time still giving tax breaks to the super rich. Now, a Labour government would have a fair tax system that's asking those with the broadest shoulders to put their fair share in.
Although Keir Starmer has dropped his pledge, hasn't he, to tax the top 5%.
But a really great way of starting that would be to reverse the non-doms tax evasion loophole, tax avoidance, I can never remember which one's which, Joe, the tax loophole, and that would help us to put more money into the NHS, and that would make a direct difference. Now, I think there are various things the Tories could do and the Labour government would do, and the Tories are choosing to preside over this. And Ben, you can't just say you regret it. You've been in power an awfully long time now. Isn't it time to take responsibility for your own tax regime?
Well, I haven't, for the record, but I think
the Tories have.
The key thing here, you talk all the time, we hear all the time, we've got higher taxes, never have. Absolutely. I think as a Conservative Party, collectively we are deeply uncomfortable with that and recognise that. But Labour keeps saying it's too high. Everything I hear, we just heard from you, Thangham, is we'll put more taxes up. We'll put capital gains tax up. How are you going to reduce taxes for working people? Because I've not heard a single thing on that.
Getting rid of tax loopholes for the super rich. We would remove the VAT loophole for private schools. Those are just 2 examples.
So you're putting 2 taxes up.
Plenty more.
So how are you reducing the cuts?
Those are about rebalancing the tax burden so that
putting more taxes
richer
up.
people are paying their fair share, which gives us more scope to invest in those
how
public
are you helping
services,
nurses with lower taxes?
Which would help by investing in those public services. And when you invest in public services, you actually create the terms and conditions which make them better off.
Is it fair for people earning just over £50,000 a year to be in a bracket that we call higher taxpayers?
I don't think it's fair for them to be in that bracket without there having been a conversation about it. And the point about more people being brought into that tax bracket is it's essentially a tax increase by stealth. The government is counting on the fact that because of inflation, because wages are rising, fiscal drag means people are put in this tax bracket without necessarily realising that that is going to happen. I mean, Ben mentioned capital gains tax at a moment ago. We're talking here about earned income, about workers, how much tax they're paying. Unearned income is paid at significantly lower. The Prime Minister's own tax rate over the course of all his earnings was, I think, something like 22% on earnings of millions.
So you'd like to see capital gains tax equalised perhaps with the higher rate of tax?
Perhaps. There were all kinds of distortions in our tax system that actually mean if you're working, you're in a worse tax position than if you're not working and just making money off the investments of somebody else.
Are you comfortable with the idea of many more workers in the country, including nurses and teachers, that are going to be dragged in, as we call it, that fiscal drag, into that higher rate?
Well, I'm never, ever going to be happy. I don't need to be comfortable. You know, I'm not part of this government.
No?
I'm never, ever going to be happy with high taxes. And it is absolutely scandalous. You've got a Conservative government. It's the highest level of tax for goodness knows how many decades. And that, I think, is regrettable. I think it really was rather ironic that when Nigel Lawson died, and people were rightly paying tribute to him, they pointed out that he was the one who stuck by his conviction that if you lowered the tax rate, you actually raised income for the Treasury. And yet, at the same time that people were saying that and paying those glowing tributes, they themselves work.
Although when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did try and suggest that, the markets freaked out,
well,
you could say.
Hang on, he didn't just suggest that. I mean, they did a huge amount all at the same time, and I think their preparation and the way they tried to sell it was terrible. But, I mean, there is a general consensus that if you do lower taxes, you can raise income if you do it in the right way.
Right. What about unearned income in that sense? What about wealth taxes, Rachel's point? Do you think it would be better, in a way, to stop freezing the tax thresholds on earned income and perhaps tax unearned wealth?
Oh, don't present them as just an either-or. I mean, I do think it's right to end the freezing of thresholds because that effectively means you're just dragging people into the higher tax bracket who shouldn't be there. But I also think you need to be very, very careful about, you know, tax the rich until it hurts. Because if you do that, you provide disincentives. You don't get people wanting to come here. You do get people looking for offshore schemes, which they won't bother to do if the tax rate is reasonable. And we've seen that in the past. So, you know, I feel very strongly that you don't look upon this as some sort of battle. Look upon this as how do we maximise revenue to the Treasury.
Rachel?
I think you can't have a conversation about wealth and taxes in this country without looking at house prices and house wealth. You've got people whose houses have doubled, tripled, gone up by sort of 10 times in value over the last couple of decades, who seem to think that they have earned that wealth, and therefore when they sell that house, stamp duty is paid by the buyer, the seller just gets to pocket the difference, and that's very, very nice for them. And then they go, well, this is our wealth, I owned it. How is that wealth more, how are they more deserving of that wealth than people who actually go to work every day and who are taxed at 40%?
Well, for a start, I would have said that home ownership is something that spans all income levels. It isn't something that's restricted to the rich. And a lot of very modest earners have saved very hard and tried very hard to own their own home.
Not people under 30,
and they benefit from that rise. So I think it is something that should be encouraged. And I certainly don't think you want to start taxing the proceeds of home ownership.
All right, let's move on. Look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph, talking about immigration. Million more migrants heading to Britain before next election. Ministers are warned. Projected influx of workers and students next year is at odds with Conservative pledge to cut the numbers, says the Home Office. Now, they are predicting, perhaps privately, 1 million more migrants. Some of the figures estimated when they come out next week on net migration point to something closer to 700,000 for 2022. Still high by historic standards. How does this sit with the repeated pledges by Conservatives and in their manifesto to bring down levels of net migration to tens of thousands?
I mean, the tens of thousands number is from, I think, several prime ministers ago. We've had a difficult time. But I think
Suella Braverman has, in her time, at least talked about bringing it down significantly.
And I think it does need to come down significantly. I think, regardless of where you want to put a number, we have significant strain on public services. We have significant strain on, British citizens being able to access things like the health service, things like the kinds of welfare and support that people need. And the more people you add to that, the more challenging that becomes.
So why is it so high then?
Well, I think the Home Secretary has laid out that she wants to see it come down significantly. But if we want to have an immigration system that is managed properly, there's two elements to that, right? One is having the points-based system, getting it working in the right places so we can bring people into the right
That has been working.
The other one is making sure we've got a fair system and we can stop people coming here illegally.
Oh, no, but we're talking about here, Ben, we're talking about legal migration here. This isn't illegal migration, which is where the Prime Minister has pledged to stop small boats. What I want to say is, despite all these pledges, whether it was for tens of thousands or significantly bringing down the number, it's risen considerably under successive Conservative governments. Why?
I think, again, the Home Secretary's right to say that we can't continue to rely on migrant labour. There's an example, and the agriculture example that we can perhaps come on to is a good example of where, again, we're going to be reliant on temporary migrant labour to support agriculture, whereas actually we've got 1 million people unemployed in this country, 2 million people economically inactive. We have to train and support people to be able to do those jobs domestically.
All right, well, let me just take you through some of the numbers. Now, these are broad figures, OK, in terms of how you break down overall migration figures, and these are gross figures, to be clear, whereas I've been talking about net migration, so the in and out. But total work visas issued in 2022, the sort of thing you were talking about under a points-based system, is just over 420,000. Total number of visas for studying, for students to come here, is 626,000, just over. Family visas, just over 48,000. And then there are various figures for the overseas schemes. So for people from Hong Kong, the Ukraine family scheme and the Ukraine sponsorship scheme. And broadly, it's about 260,000. What would you cut?
Well, I think we need, as I say, we've become very reliant over a long period of time because of free movement on that movement of labour that we can no longer rely on, we shouldn't rely on, and therefore
so you'd cut the work visas,
well,
you'd cut the 423,000 work visas.
Reduce the amount of people coming here to work and train the 3 million people in this country who are currently out of work.
All right, well, where would you cut the figures, if at all?
Well, one of the things we would do is notice the connections here. Ben talks about strain on public services. In fact, the NHS has a huge workforce gap, which successive Tory governments have failed to address, which is one of the reasons why we have people coming here on work visas. And incidentally, Ben, not because of free movement of people within the European Union, because we're out of that now. A lot of these people are coming from nowhere near Europe, and they're coming to fill gaps in the workforce in the NHS and other industries that the successive Tory governments have woefully failed to address. Right. I don't know what's wrong with Rishi Sunak and his weak leadership that he's allowing this situation when he and his ministers.
But what would you cut? Let's say you inherit 700,000 as the net migration figure, and that may be fine. Maybe we need that number of people coming into the country. What would you cut? Would you cut work visas, students coming over, family visas, or the overseas schemes?
We would make sure, for a start, those 2 million people who are out of work and unable to work, many of them are waiting for NHS operations and procedures, so we try and get more workforce into the NHS, which would have two effects on migration. It would bring down the number of people we are trying to get.
Over a longish period.
Yes, but it's at least it's a plan, Ben. Where's yours? I mean, and then we would also be getting people treated. She is the Home Secretary. I think she's in charge of immigration right now.
And
so she's basically criticising herself. You've been in charge for 13 years, Ben.
Do you admit it's a failure?
It is extraordinary.
I think
weak leadership from the top, weak leadership from Rishi Sunak has led us to this situation where you guys are literally fighting with yourselves over your own policies.
We're in a place now where Labour's position on what we would do is exactly the same as what the Home Secretary said she is planning to do. That's where we are. I do think
we lead where you follow.
I do think it's a failure because I think
I'm glad you've
my
admitted you're a
constituents
failure.
would, over many, many years, going back to the 90s, it's a failure because we cannot rely on and we cannot sustain 500,000 plus people net migration into the country every year.
And yet you've been in government.
All right.
You're doing nothing.
Where would you cut? If you were given those numbers, where would you cut? Because that's what people say.
The crucial thing here is you've got 1.2 million unemployed, and yet we're having to bring people in.
Right.
Absolutely.
And those two things just don't add up. And it really is essential that we skill our own work.
But that does take time, doesn't it?
It takes a bit of time. But picking in the fields doesn't actually require an awful lot of time.
But do UK workers want to do it? That's what we are being
to do it.
Right.
But there's a question there's a question of can't and won't. And if they won't do it, why should we pay them to sit at home?
Right. Well, what would you do to compel them?
I would say if they're fit enough to do it, I'm not talking about people who couldn't do it, but if they're fit enough to do it, and that would certainly apply to most of the young, I would say, right, well, if you don't do this, I'm afraid you lose benefit.
But do you accept that there are other shortages and gaps in the labour market that need to be filled? We were told by Boris Johnson and others that it would be a highly skilled, high-wage economy. Well, maybe to some extent that 423,000 is actually filling those gaps, and we've got highly skilled and highly paid people coming in from abroad.
when he talked about a highly skilled and high-paid economy, which I'm totally signed up to, I mean, I think that's exactly what we want to see, he wasn't talking about it happening by Tuesday afternoon. And I think one of the problems... No, he wasn't.
No, what I'm saying is maybe there needed to be a more honest discussion about that.
Yeah, that's I was just about to say exactly that one of the problems of political discourse in this country is that it's very short-term. I mean, unless you're talking about pensions, when they do actually look long-term, it's very short-term. And we need to have a much more grown-up debate, and I think that goes for the NHS as well. Don't fool around and say it's all about money. It isn't. It's about a lot more than that is built up over the years.
But isn't it also about a workforce strategy that acknowledges that training is an important part of how you build up the skilled workforce we need from British people who currently lack skills and qualifications? This is a government without an industrial strategy, without a workforce strategy, without a training strategy, all of which a Labour government would be bringing in. Yes, those are long-term solutions for long-term problems, but we need a government that's actually thinking about the long term, as opposed to one that just goes through every winter as though winter is a surprise, chucks a bit of money at the NHS and expects that to fill the workforce gaps, which never happens.
I'm going to come to you, Rachel, in just a moment. You raised a question at Prime Minister's Questions last week about your frustration at levelling up. You were talking it broadly, but it would include, I presume, investment in education, investment in the sort of jobs and apprenticeships that perhaps is still lacking.
Well, I think that part of the answer to this is that, as in many issues, there's no investment strategy. You can have all sorts of strategies that sit on a shelf and nobody looks at.
No, they're not really on a shelf.
The key thing to me is local areas, local business will know best, local colleges and providers know best what skills and how to work with people. That's why I'm pushing around levelling up, because what that brings to our part of the world is the devolved adult skills budget and the opportunity to work with colleges and businesses.
But the delivery hasn't been there, has it?
Well, it's taken too long, and that's what I said last week.
I mean, that is the issue. Long-term strategies don't work very well with the sort of electoral cycles, or perhaps as people felt they were promised in the referendum that these things would be quicker than they've turned out to be.
I mean, I think the entire premise of this whole conversation is flawed, I'm afraid. I mean, we've got the caption on the TV at the moment that's reading, is migration out of control? No, it's not out of control. It's being controlled by the government. These people, we're not talking about illegal migration. We're talking about legal migration, people who have been granted visas for studying or for work because of the points-based system that the government said it would introduce, and now it has introduced it. And actually, public sentiment, I'm sorry, Ben, really isn't with your particular line on this at the moment. All of
Come
the
up to my
anxiety...
constituency and have that conversation.
I'm sorry, but the national polling shows that people are concerned about control over immigration. But if you talk about numbers and you say, how about people coming for these jobs? How about people coming to work in our NHS, in our care sector, to pick our fruit? A majority of people want migration levels to stay the same or increase. You are in a minority here.
The whole point of Brexit was that we would not close, but we would control our borders.
And we are controlling them. We're issuing visas.
45,000 people came in boats last year. They're not controlled borders.
That's illegal migration. I think
but that is not a controlled border. That is not a controlled border.
I think you should stop trying to say
because we are focusing on legal migration. So, Anne, if you're talking about legal migration, do you accept Rachel's point that the government is controlling it?
That's what I was just trying to say before everybody else plunged in. What I was saying was that the whole point of Brexit was that you controlled the borders, that you said, that you said who could come here, what their qualifications were, the terms on which they could come, whether they'd be eligible for benefit. In other words, it wasn't a given right.
No.
It was something you controlled. Oh. And that is what the government is supposed to be doing.
So what's wrong with 700,000 net migration?
Well, I would say it's too high, given that we have 1.2 million unemployed. If we had nobody unemployed...
We have the lowest unemployment since the 70s.
Yes, but we've still got 1.2 million. You can't ignore them. They're there, and they need skilling.
OK, so if they took some jobs, would you... And we still had shortages in the NHS, in agriculture, in our care sector, in lorry drivers. If we had zero unemployed, but we still had those shortages...
We'd be able to skill our own lorry drivers. We can't skill our own lorry drivers. We can give up.
If we had a zero unemployment rate and we still had those shortages... No problem.
Well, if there was a zero unemployment rate, the economy would be in much better shape and we might just be able to absorb them.
Right, so should then politicians be saying that actually 500, 600,000 net migration a year is what the country needs?
I think fundamentally you cannot have an honest conversation with the public about how you control your borders and what your migration figures are if the public overwhelmingly can see that we cannot control our borders.
That is, you're talking about people coming over
the public
in small boats.
perception
These are not in the figures.
We cannot control who comes. That's the public perception in my constituency.
And whose fault is that? if
and
it's
that is a
public
massive
perception that's not
post-COVID
actually...
challenge we have failed to deal with over the last few years, absolutely. And we've made steps, and we're making steps to try and do that, much to the anger and fury of huge proportions of
I think it's incredibly disingenuous for you to combine the issues of legal and illegal migration.
They are completely separate issues. They are separate issues from a policy perspective. We're having a conversation now. We cannot control who comes in and out of this country.
If they're confused,
they both add
maybe
up to
it's
a huge strain on the infrastructure.
They do, absolutely.
If they are confused, maybe it's because you're on this programme ostensibly to talk about legal migration, and at every turn you have tried to turn the conversation to illegal migration. Surely you, as an elected MP, should understand the difference and how those are different policy challenges.
I understand you have to have confidence in a system, and the impact on the infrastructure is the same.
All right, and we'll come on to the infrastructure in just a moment. Let's talk a little bit more, though, about low pay, or certainly for certain jobs. Do you think Brexit, to some extent, has had an impact, Thangham, on boosting wages for some low-skilled work, which was the complaint, actually, under Ed Miliband, and when he was Labour leader, that actually there were people coming in from the EU and undercutting, he felt, certain industries. That's changed a little bit because some of those low-skilled wages have increased.
And I'd like to see all employers pay all their staff decent wages, decent terms and conditions, and have training. Well, but that has to be part of an industrial strategy, and it also has to be led by a government that actually sets out to achieve those things. Now, what we've had from various Tory Prime Ministers, including the latest one, is lots and lots of words and very little behind that. And Ben has already said, it's all very well having a strategy. Having a strategy actually helps you to deliver on the words that you say. We've got a really weak Prime Minister at the moment who may say all sorts of things about migration, who may say all sorts of things about this and that, but he doesn't seem to have anything to follow through. I would like to see us having an employment bill, a workers' rights bill, which a Labour government will bring in, which would make sure that we do have proper rules. Well, I can tell you, first of all, we will have proper rules for trade union negotiations. We would have rules on wages and wage negotiation. We would also have the option for workers to have more flexible working, which allows them to be more productive, if that's appropriate for their workforce. I can go on, Ben, if you would like.
Is there anything?
And what have you got? You've got nothing.
In what way is more bureaucracy and more burden on business going to lead to higher wages? It's not.
Right. I mean, they've redesignated the care sector broadly, not all care workers, to be a highly skilled, or certainly more highly skilled area of work than it has been. Would there be other areas that you would include in that, which might increase work visas, but that we have shortages in?
Possibly. I would hesitate to name stuff just off the top of my head, but I think certainly in care, the key things to me are around, and as council leader, I'm in charge of care locally, the key things are around attractive career paths into health and care, not just to be
you get more UK workers
to have opportunities. Then you would attract more UK workers. And also, to some extent, the opposite of what you've said, less rules and regulations that might allow people to have more flexible workforce.
Deregulation, I think, is crucial, and it isn't happening. It really isn't happening.
Just briefly, before we move on to students, because they make up quite a large number, there seems to be a divide in Cabinet about it. On the one side, you've got Jeremy Hunt and Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, saying it's a great British export, but the number of students coming over with dependents is also very high. Who is winning that argument? Clearly, at the moment, it's Jeremy Hunt and Gillian Keegan.
I think there is an argument that students shouldn't be in the migration figures at all. You should count them if they finish their degrees and then want to stay and work here. But if they're going to go back to their countries, why are you counting them in the first place? Now, we do have a problem in our university sectors, which is universities are over-reliant on foreign students because they can charge much higher fees. They're restricted in what they can charge here. Funding is suffering, and so they are relying on that foreign income. But I think, again, if you look at public polling, most of the public don't think that students should be included in those numbers. They don't think that that counts as migration in the way that other areas do. It's very, very disingenuous to kind of group all of these together and say it's too high, it's out of control. And it's particularly disingenuous to hear that line from a Home Secretary who is enacting the actual policy that she is now criticising.
I mean, first of all, the students are not a cohort who just come and go. They're coming in every year.
Yes, so you should count them when they choose to stay at the end of their degrees rather than
I heard you say that. I'm trying to reply to that. They're not just a cohort. You've got a steady flow in, and yes, some will stay and some will go back. But all the time they are here, they have to be housed, they have to have health services, they have to have all the things that the rest of the population have, and rightly so that they should have them. So they are a strain on the infrastructure and they should be counted.
Before we move on, briefly, Nigel Farage admitted on Newsnight last night that Brexit has failed. Do you agree with him?
No, because I don't think we've got Brexit. I mean, that is the problem. You can't blame Brexit. What you have to blame is what's been done with Brexit. For example, what I expected, and really thought was going to happen was that we would gradually, it wasn't going to happen by Tuesday afternoon, but we'd gradually become competitive with Europe, instead of which we're aligned with them. We've raised our corporation tax to the same level as France. We are bonkers.
Well, on that note, we are bonkers. I'm going to introduce the idea of switching off, but not, of course, from this programme. The Financial Times, this headline, Labour Party plans right to switch off for out-of-hours workers. A manifesto proposal would echo legislation across Europe to stop bosses contacting staff. Thangham, you're on the shadow front bench. Can you explain what this proposal is about?
Yes, so this is part of our wider package of workers' rights, which we want to bring in, which are both good for business and good for workers. The right to switch off is never going to be something which should apply to everybody. There's always going to be certain workforces, certain sectors where that's not going to work. But for those people who are employed between 9 and 5, who have the sort of jobs that
so
don't
office-based
really...
mainly.
You know, and that should be something where if you're paid to work between 9 and 5, you shouldn't be contacted by your boss at 9 o'clock at night. I think that's fair enough. I think if you're on call, you should be paid for being on call, and then, of course, you can be contacted. This is just about a reasonable, fair way of organising the workforce, because healthy, happy workers make better workers in any case, and to be constantly on call, to be constantly thinking if I don't reply to my boss's email at 9 o'clock at night, that's not a good way to treat with a workforce.
And would it be enforced? Would it be compulsory? Would there be sanctions?
Well, we want to work with employers and trade unions on how that could be effective. And I think it's important that we recognise this won't apply to every sector. There will be some sectors where that doesn't work. But we're working on this policy at the moment. And as you said, it's something that we're looking at to bring into our manifesto commitments as part of a wider package of workers' rights reform.
What's wrong with it?
Sounds like a massively top-down, meddling, burdensome set of regulations, to be honest. And actually, increasingly, more and more businesses and more people work flexibly, more and more people work from home. That's so out of touch with the changing nature of the workforce. And actually, why should the government decide when people can and can't email their staff or their employers?
Standards.
You can't legislate for common sense and proportionality.
Absolutely.
You can't legislate for those.
You wouldn't
they are things which a boss and his staff either have or they don't. The idea that you can legislate as if it's one homogenous thing is just a nonsense.
When we legislated for the Minimum Wage Act, people told us the world would end, and it didn't. It just meant people were paid better.
But you said you were going to pay vastly more than you actually paid.
And we have seen an improvement in workers' rights under successive Labour governments, which then get undermined by Tory governments, under which we've also got stagnant rates of growth, stagnant rates of productivity and staggering rates of complacency.
Adding more bureaucracy to business will help with
nothing
growth.
you're doing is helping, is it? I think that with a weak Prime Minister, which we have at the moment in Rishi Sunak, it's about time we had someone who is a good leader, who sees that having good workers' rights has always improved rates of productivity, and that's what we want to do.
I mean, things have changed, haven't they, since COVID? You're right. Flexible working has become much more prevalent. But also, there are shortages in the workforce because there have been lots of people in their 50s, in my age group, that have left the workforce. Retaining people has been tricky. Would this not help?
No, I think it'll make it harder because you're limiting the flexibility that business has to employ people. What we need to do in that space is change, and we, you know, as a council, we're changing our HR proposals so that we can go to that group, particularly over 50s, and say, how can you work for us? How can we be more flexible? How can we support you to help us with our gaps? Not to say from a government level, there's this blanket regime that we're going to enforce on businesses. It'll make it worse.
Rachel? One of the few benefits of the pandemic and of changing working practices was everyone went and worked remotely, and employers realised that employees could do the jobs from home, and actually if they worked flexibly in a way that suited them, they were more productive. What has the government's response to that been? Lazy workers need to get back into the office. Barely a week goes by until you see a Conservative minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg was big on this when he was in Cabinet, but others do it too, saying, why aren't the workers back at their desks? Why aren't they back there? Why are they not working at home? One of the very few benefits that we've got from this mass experiment in home working, people enjoy it, people work more productively, they work more flexibly, they can get more done. It's great for working parents who have to schedule their work around the school day.
Well, that would make it more difficult then, wouldn't it, to say out of hours, you can't call me if you were perhaps going out in the afternoon and they wanted to work later in the evening.
I didn't say I was a supporter of the policy. I don't think the government should be getting involved in it. I think we should be having a conversation. Any government, no, I think we should be having a conversation about fair expectations that workplaces place on their workers. I think we should definitely be having a conversation about some very, very dangerous sounding things like workplace surveillance, where bosses are looking at their employees' keystrokes when they're working remotely and all kinds of things like that. I think it has to be part of a wider conversation, and I also think that anyone who expects their staff to reply out of office should at least supply them with a work phone, which most of them don't. But overall, this is a conversation about trust, people working in a way that suits them, and the government not getting involved by demanding that you go back to the office because, what, they're invested in the real estate sector?
Well, should we not then trust two adults, boss, employee,
Yes,
or whatever
exactly.
relationship, to be able to have that conversation?
Jacob Rees-Mogg keeps telling bosses, two adults, to say that you should be back at work. I mean, this is ridiculous. We are talking about a process
Jacob
whereby
Rees-Mogg
we
is not
would
in
work in
government, for the record.
we would work in partnership with businesses and with trade unions on what makes sense for different sectors and different groups of workers.
Have you?
I see nothing wrong with that.
I mean,
at all. It's an expectation.
has Labour, has Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, have they spoken to business? Is this something
Yes.
they welcome?
Yes,
they
have.
would like to bring. Okay.
Keir, Rachel, Angela, Johnny Reynolds speak to businesses every single day.
And businesses want
tell
this
us,
new
and
law.
businesses tell us constantly that what they're looking for from government is a stability which they do not see
and
from the
businesses
Tory
want this
government.
new right,
and they want us to
And
provide that
businesses want this
stability.
new right.
They want us to provide stability and stability of an economy, and that's what we're talking to them
And that's
about.
Will you
including
answer
this.
my question? Have businesses indicated that they would like this law that prevents bosses
businesses
contacting
want
their
to have a
employees?
partnership,
That's a
and
no.
that's what they get from us.
I tell you what
That's
Actually
businesses.
talking
That's a
to
no.
I tell you what
them.
That's a
businesses
no.
would
Well, they
like.
don't get anything from the Tories
Closer
because they're not even
cooperation.
talking to them.
Businesses would like closer cooperation with the EU and harmonised EU standards, and you didn't seem to care too much about that
Yes.
a moment ago.
That's
when
what
you
they
said
said
Brexit had never been tried.
repeatedly.
No, it's the
All
last thing
businesses
I
have a
want.
homogenous
Last
view,
thing I
apparently.
So we have to listen to businesses.
Hang on,
voice.
don't talk over each other. Rachel, you say what you were going to say, and I'll go to the others.
No, I just think it's interesting that in some areas we have to take what businesses want. Businesses don't want this. They won't invest in our country if we do this. We absolutely can't touch this. We have to take that as sort of gospel. And other areas where businesses saying we need close cooperation with the EU, Brexit has been incredibly damaging to British businesses, then we ignore them. It seems like a double standard to me. Maybe Anne can explain it.
Well, certainly big business wanted to have much closer cooperation with Europe.
They wanted to stay as they were because it was comfortable. But actually, you know, business can really benefit from this if government allows them to. But
Well,
so does
without
work.
going back to Brexit, on the idea of switching off, do you switch off?
No, it's very difficult. I try, to be fair, to get everything. I'll stay up late on a Friday, box my inbox off so I can do my kids' football on a Saturday, and that's my switch off.
Do you switch off, Anne? I mean, would this help people switch off if they thought they weren't going to be contacted out of hours?
In case you've missed it, I'm retired.
Yes, well, you know what I mean. Generally. I haven't missed it, actually.
No.
But even
Well, I
before,
was-
did you ever switch off?
Did I ever switch off? I think that if the Prime Minister had rung me up when I was a minister and I had been switched off, I would have been switched off quite permanently.
Rachel?
Well, you know what journalism's like. The
Yes.
line between jobs
Well,
and life, that's non-existent.
And that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, there'd be so many
sectors will
in
work.
politics, journalism, anything that works over NHS, or is it a generational thing?
There are different sectors where it would work and other sectors where it wouldn't work. And I think being a member of Parliament, it's important that you do get a family time, but it's also we need to recognise the fact it's a full-time occupation being a member of Parliament, and I remain available to my constituents as much as possible. But we still need a balance, and I want that for other people as well.
Well, and
Can I just pick up on something that Rachel said, because I was trying to earlier, because I think it's important. I think she's absolutely right. I welcome working from home. I welcome that social revolution that followed COVID. And I welcome the flexibility that it involves, particularly for mothers with young children and people not commuting and all the rest of it. Great, fantastic. But it's based on trust. It's based on the employer trusting the worker to be working. And because of that bond of trust, it's got to be possible for the employer to ring up outside standard office hours because that person isn't working standard office hours.
Right. Well, the one final thing is presenteeism, as I think it was called. People staying late, sitting in the office for hours and hours, but not actually really doing anything. It looked good, but it wasn't very productive. I mean, do you think this sort of proposal could end that idea of people just trying to prove that they're working long, hard hours when actually they're not?
I mean, I think COVID has kind of already done that, and you no longer get points simply for sitting in an office not doing anything. You also no longer get points for turning up at the office very obviously unwell to give your virus to literally everyone else because you were afraid to take a sick day. So, yeah, there are benefits of the way the pandemic has changed working practices and trying to sort of go back in time and say it never happened. Like, why would we get rid of one of the very few positive things that has happened over the last couple of years?
But why try to over-regulate it, which is what Thangham wants to do?
Let's show you this. Let's show you this. We're talking about food. That's because there is a Downing Street summit today. The headline is "Food Prices," which, if you haven't noticed, soar as Prime Minister meets industry. Now, we're seeing the average prices of some of the very basic foods rise, hitting a 45-year high of 19% in March. We've seen a whopping 52% increase for cucumber, which has gone up by 29 pence. Lettuce has increased to 22 pence. With cheese, that's a £2.76 rise to more than £9 per kilo. Butter is up by 55 pence and bread 31 pence. So overall, that is going to cost you £4.13 pence more than in 2022, a 39 pence rise. Now, I want you all to repeat that, what I've just read. No, I'm only joking, obviously. I mean, Ben, what can be done, if anything at all, to bring down the soaring price of food, which is at about 19% on average?
Yeah, and it's a big pressure. And clearly, you know, one of the Prime Minister's key priorities for this year is halving inflation over the course of this year. That's massively important. I think there's a number of factors in this, both long and short term. Firstly, it's worth saying we've got a £94 billion package of welfare support. I think outside of COVID, probably the biggest welfare package ever in history in terms of supporting people with costs. But actually, things like improving trade around agriculture, the food strategy talks about how we put farming and agriculture at the heart of all that. And back to our immigration strategy, actually, we've released some temporary working visas for people to come and help get things onto shelves, which will help as well, although we need to phase that out over time. So I think the government is, you know, working in all sorts of ways to try and support people, but, you know, couldn't bring that inflation down. It's not an overnight fix.
Well, no, we've discovered it's still at around 10%. I mean, Rachel, should the government be intervening to try and help consumers with their food bills?
I think when you've got an issue where food poverty is so high and the prices of food inflation is just shot up by that extent, you need the government to keep an eye on what is going on. And actually, what is going on is a really interesting question because, yes, food has become more expensive to produce. The price of fertiliser is up, the price of labour is up, energy bills, all of that is true. But at the same time, the profit margins of the supermarkets, the price that they are paying at the farmers for the food at wholesale versus the price that they are charging consumers, there is a massive gap between that. And we need to have a conversation about why that is and what we can do about it. When we had the energy crisis, there was a windfall tax on oil and gas companies because there was an understanding that while everyone else was suffering, really suffering, it wasn't right for certain companies to profit from that suffering. Maybe we should be having a similar conversation now about the supermarkets.
Well, we can show you the headline. Anna, get you to comment. Bloomberg, soaring UK food prices forces competition watchdog to investigate. The term greedflation has been bandied about as an accusation that the supermarkets are over-profiting from these rising food prices.
Well, I used to represent a rural constituency, and even then, you know, and I've been retired 13 years, even then the farmers would complain constantly about the supermarkets, about their demands. You know, you mustn't have a little scrape on a carrot, it must be a beautiful sort of carrot, about their pricing, and they appeared to hold the whip hand, and that doesn't appear to have changed. But I wish to make a general comment, which is this, that the only way this is going to be tackled is if inflation comes down. You will not get inflation coming down while you have inflationary wage rises, and we've got to face that. Some of the wage demands at the moment are utterly unrealistic, and they will fuel inflation, and we'll be back to where we were. And I lived through the 70s. I'm probably the only one on this panel who did. I lived through the 70s, and that was exactly what happened. Prices went up, so people said, we've got to have wage rises to enable us to buy. And therefore...
But it is a catch-22, isn't it, if the cost of living is still going up? What do you do even now, at this point, with rising prices at the rate they are now for basic foodstuffs?
Well, I mean, Jim McMahon, who's our DEFRA Shadow Secretary of State, has been calling on the government for action for months and months now.
In fact,
we had a food summit several months ago. There are several things you could do. Nothing's going to be straightforward, but there are some things you could do. You could use the oil and gas levy now to support those energy-intensive industries. Farming would obviously be a strong contender for that. That's the first thing. The second thing you could do is get an agricultural deal on veterinary inspections so that that cross-border trade in agriculture and food products was easier. That's something the agriculture industry, but also food retailers and food producers are crying out for. That would also benefit consumers. And you could decide that you are going to use the UK's considerable purchasing power in public procurement and focus primarily, or wherever possible, on locally grown food, on food grown in this country, to help the food industry actually to right itself. Now, I think those are three things the government could do and a Labour government would do, and we've been calling on the government to take action on this for months. But I also wish to differ from Anne here, because I think I understand, I think it was the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I may be wrong, who said last week that the primary cause of inflation was not public sector wage rises, it was food prices going up, and we can see that in the shopping basket which Joe showed us just then.
Would you subsidise? Would you ever
sector wages?
Well,
the price of bread?
no, and that we talk about it all the time, but at the moment they haven't agreed to some of those certainly inflation matching or inflation busting pay rises, and much of it is global forces. That's what the government keeps telling us. It's about the war in Ukraine, food prices going up as a result, and energy prices going up. Would you subsidise any foodstuffs, any of the basics, in order to help consumers? Either of you?
I can't imagine it happening. I think there's this challenge, isn't there? Whenever you've got limited supply and energy and food and all the rest of it, through things like global conflict, that there is always lead to rising prices. The challenge is exactly as Anne described. It's not a popular or attractive one, but it is that balance that if the more you spend in trying to help people, the more that drives inflation. So you do have to balance those things like pay rises and like the welfare support, because if you go too far, and we've seen a lot of some of this is caused by the massive levels of spending to keep people in work through COVID.
And we've seen it.
Food price, that's not what put food prices up, though,
That's
is it?
what's driven
I think
inflation.
we need
War in
food
Ukraine
security.
certainly helped
We need a
put
food
food prices
security
up.
policy that puts at its heart protecting our farming and food production industry, and also encourages to make sure that in supermarkets are not indulging in non-competitive practices.
Well, they deny that, of course.
And I know they
the
do,
supermarkets
but we need to make sure that that's happening.
Right, they deny that that is what's happening. Actually, the margins are closer, they argue, than perhaps you were suggesting earlier, Rachel. But of course, there is this investigation now going on, and energy prices, or the price of wholesale gas, is falling. But we're not seeing it, are we yet, coming through?
Not yet. But I mean, what we should understand is, first of all, that our food prices are still lower than a lot of Europe. Secondly, that a huge amount of food inflation was driven by Ukraine. Not by Ukraine, by the war in Ukraine. And that has made an enormous difference. And we just have to be as grown up about this as we can and stop thinking it's purely a UK problem, because it isn't. And we also just have to learn the lessons of the past, as I've already said, which is that prices follow wages, follow prices, follow wages. We've seen it.
Yeah, but what do you say to consumers who
can't
literally can't afford to pay even for some of the basics if they've gone up the way that cheese sandwich has with all its ingredients?
Well, then you don't do the cheese sandwich.
We're talking about basics. We're talking about absolute basics and staples. We're talking about own brand pasta. You're talking about bread. You're talking about families who cannot afford to feed their children. There's a story today about mothers who can't afford formula milk, so their babies are literally starving at the moment. And so the government
We've been through this before.
So the government shouldn't be doing anything.
Because we've been
so
years
you would
now,
let the children go
because
hungry.
we've been decades without inflation. We've come to regard it as some sort of given right.
Which is should the poorest and most vulnerable be helped out more when it comes out?
They are being helped out.
But especially on the idea of food.
I mean, they are being helped.
I have not seen there's no
line.
public sector pay rise that's anywhere near the increase in the price of a cheese sandwich that you just pointed out, Joe. And we are also forgetting here, well, I'm not forgetting it, and I don't think anyone at home who couldn't pay their rent or their mortgage last month has forgotten, that the Tories crashed the economy through failure to plan, failure to make a decent budget actually help people by giving tax breaks to the rich and nothing to working people. That's what happened last autumn, and we're all still paying the price. We can't just pretend this is all about the war in Ukraine, because it isn't just about the war in Ukraine. It's not just that.
The trillions that were spent to make
That's not what's put the price of cheese up.
To make quite certain that people could be paid even if they couldn't work.
That's not what's put the price of cheese up.
Do we have to accept that we're going to have to pay more for food, even if the rate at which prices rise start to fall?
I think so. If inflation comes back down to 2%, food will still be more than it was 18 months ago.
Completely will. I mean, so when people say or hear the Prime Minister saying we're going to cut inflation or it's going to be hard, people, still, we all have to realise that it's still rising.
It's the rate of inflation.
Absolutely. So do we just have to accept we're going to have to pay a lot more for our food?
Sure, I think we have to accept that we're going to be poorer and that fuel is going to be more expensive and that food is going to be more expensive. I just don't think that's a particularly compelling message for the Tories to take to the next election.
But it's quite a compelling message. Just to round off the show there, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of our guests. Bye-bye.